The silence in the room was heavy, thick enough to choke the four men holding suppressed pistols to the back of Antonio Rizzo's head. For 20 years, Antonio, known to the streets as Black Quiet, had ruled this city with a phone in one hand and a wedding ring on the other. But at 9:00 p.m. sharp, the rules changed. Slowly, with the deliberate grace of a man who had already seen the end, Antonio reached for his left hand. His men stiffened. Roman Volkov's finger tightened on the trigger. They expected a plea, a bribe, or a final command. Instead, they watched as Antonio slid the gold band off his finger and placed it gently on the mahogany table. Next to it, he laid his old, worn phone, the device that held the life and death of every soldier in the city. No more orders, no more promises, no more mercy. Antonio didn't look back at the barrels aimed at his skull. He simply closed his eyes, his weathered face settling into a mask of finality. His men froze. They had seen Antonio kill, but they had never seen him quit. By putting down that phone, he wasn't surrendering. He was deactivating the only thing that kept the monsters in the city under control. He was no longer the boss protecting an empire. He was a man with nothing left to lose. Stay with me until the end, because what Antonio did the moment he stood up from that table didn't just break the underworld. It rewrote the laws of blood and loyalty forever. Before we dive into the shadow of the Black Quiet, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment below. If you had to disappear, what's the one thing you'd leave behind? Now let's get started. The gold band on Antonio Rizzo's finger was never just jewelry. It was a shackle of his own making, a weight that anchored his soul to the earth while his hands did the work of the devil. To understand the man they called Black Quiet, one had to understand that his rise to power was not fueled by greed or a thirst for blood, but by a desperate, suffocating need to build a wall tall enough that the world could never climb over it to reach Alina. He remembered the early days in the North End, when the air smelled of salt and cheap tobacco, and he was nothing more than a ghost in the shadows of greater men. Even then, he had looked at Alina, with her eyes like morning light and a laugh that seemed too fragile for the gray concrete of their neighborhood, and realized that the only way to keep that light from being extinguished was to become the darkness that surrounded it. He climbed the ranks not by shouting, but by the terrifying efficiency of his silence. Every body buried, every rival silenced, and every ledger balanced in red was a brick in the fortress he was building around her. He took the name Black Quiet because he learned early on that the loudest man in the room was the easiest to kill, but the man who said nothing was the one who was already standing behind you. By the time he was 40, the city belonged to him, but the more he owned, the more he realized the terrible math of the underworld. For every inch of territory he gained, the target on Alina's back grew larger. He created the bubble, a curated reality where the screams of his business never reached her ears. He bought the estate on the hill, surrounded by iron gates and men whose only job was to breathe when he told them to. He wore the ring as a promise, not just to her but to himself, that there was still a human being left inside the monster. The ring was his tether to the light. Every time he stepped out of a black sedan after a negotiation that left the floorboards soaked in copper-scented misery, he would twist that gold band until it bit into his skin, reminding him that he was still Antonio, the boy who loved a girl from the bakery, and not just the Black Quiet. But the underworld is a jealous god. It demands everything. As the years bled into one another, the wall he built began to feel less like a fortress and more like a tomb. He had spent his life becoming the most dangerous man in the city just to keep her safe, only to realize that the danger was now radiating from the very chair he sat upon. The shift began not with a bang, but with a ripple in the silence he so carefully maintained. Antonio sat in his study, the dim amber light reflecting off the polished wood of his desk, and felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the winter air outside. It was the silent leak, a microscopic fracture in the loyalty of his inner circle. For weeks, the atmosphere in the warehouse had changed. Roman Volkov, his most trusted enforcer, had started looking at the floor instead of Antonio's eyes. Nico Calderon was spending too much time on his encrypted messaging apps. But the moment the floor dropped out of Antonio's world was when he checked the security perimeter logs of his own home. There were gaps, small, 3-second flickers in the feed that a normal man wouldn't notice, but Antonio was a man built on the study of anomalies. Someone was mapping the house. Someone was timing the rotation of the guards. They weren't looking for a way to hit his shipments or his vaults. They were looking for Alina. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest, a sensation of drowning while standing perfectly still. His own wolves, the men he had fed and protected, had finally realized that the boss's only weakness was the woman in the garden. They were no longer guarding the fortress. They were measuring it for a siege. The confirmation arrived in the form of Luca Ferraro, a man who existed on the fringes of the life, a witness to things most people chose to unsee. They met in the back of a hollowed-out chapel, the air smelling of wax and old dust. Luca didn't speak at first. He simply handed over a folder. Inside was the final proof, a digital signature, a contract, and a photograph of Alina taken from a long-range lens through their bedroom window. The hit was already signed. The price was the throne, and the currency was Alina's life. Roman had brokered a deal with the rival factions to remove the distraction, so the business could run without the boss's emotional interference. Luca's voice was a dry rasp as he whispered, "They think you've gone soft, Antonio. They think the ring has made your hands weak." Antonio stared at the photo of his wife. She was smiling at a bird on the terrace, completely unaware that she was being viewed through a crosshair. In that moment, the black quiet felt the last of his mercy evaporate. If the ring made him weak, he would remove it. If the phone made him a target, he would drop it. The underworld wanted a monster. He would give them the one they had spent 20 years teaching him to be. That evening, Antonio returned home for the last waltz. He found Alina in the kitchen, the scent of basil and garlic filling the air, a domestic peace that felt like a hallucination. He held her longer than usual, burying his face in her hair, memorizing the scent of her skin because he knew that after tonight, he could never be the man she loved again. To save her, he had to die in her eyes. They ate in a silence that was, for once, not a professional tool but a profound mourning. He watched her move, the way she tucked a stray hair behind her ear, and felt a grief so sharp it threatened to break his composure. He was going to burn the world down, and he was going to start with the bridge that led back to her. "I love you," he whispered across the table. She smiled, sensing a weight but not its source. "I know, Antonio, you always have." He looked down at his wedding ring, the gold reflecting the candlelight, and knew it was the last time he would wear it in her presence. By morning, he would be a ghost, and she would be a widow to a man who was still walking the earth. The next day, the invitation went out. It was a simple, short-range broadcast to the inner circle, Warehouse 7900 p.m. final briefing. Roman, Nico, Thomas, and the others arrived expecting a plan for expansion, or perhaps a confession of retreat. They entered the cold, cavernous space to find Antonio sitting alone at a small table in the center of the room, illuminated by a single overhead bulb. The 4 wolves stood behind him, their guns drawn as a precaution, though they didn't yet know why their pulses were racing. This was the abdication. With the precision of a surgeon, Antonio reached up and slid the ring from his finger. The click of the gold hitting the wood echoed like a gunshot. Then he placed his phone beside it. The men behind him froze. This was the ritual of the end. He told them with a voice that sounded like grinding stones that the boss was dead. He explained that as long as he held the title, they had a target to aim at, but now he was nothing. He was the power of zero. Without the phone, there were no more orders to follow. Without the ring, there was no more man to appeal to. He looked Roman in the eye through the reflection in a darkened window and said, "You wanted the throne. It's yours. But you forgot one thing. I am the one who built the floor you're standing on, and I just took out the screws." As the realization of their mistake began to dawn on the traders, Antonio became the ghost in the machine. The warehouse, which they thought was a trap for him, was actually a trap for them. He had preset the facility's fire suppression systems to vent liquid nitrogen, and as the temperature plummeted, the chaos began. Antonio didn't need a gun. He had 20 years of intimate knowledge of their fears. He slipped into the shadows he had mastered decades ago, moving through the facility like a wraith. One by one, the Judas fall began. Nico was the first to realize that the phone Antonio left on the table wasn't just a symbol. It was a beacon that had already uploaded their locations, their bank accounts, and their private betrayals to every federal agency and rival gang in the hemisphere. They were dead men walking before they even left the room. Roman tried to flee, but he found that every door, every car, and every safe house had been wiped from his access. Antonio had deleted their existence with a single keystroke before putting the phone down. In the final hours before dawn, Antonio stood in the rain outside a coastal safe house, watching through a window as Alina was ushered into a waiting vehicle by men he had paid a lifetime's fortune to trust, men who didn't know his name, only his money. This was his ultimate sacrifice. She would be taken to a place where Antonio Rizzo didn't exist, where she would be safe, wealthy, and forever alone. He watched the car pull away until its taillights were swallowed by the mist. He didn't follow. He couldn't. He had become the legend of the quiet, a story whispered in the dark corners of bars to keep young soldiers in line. He walked toward the docks, his hands empty, his finger bare, and his heart a cold, dark room. The underworld knew it was over because the only man who knew how to keep the peace had decided that the price of war was finally worth it. He disappeared into the gray light of the morning, leaving behind a city in flames and a gold ring on a table, a silent testament to the man who gave up everything to save the only thing that mattered. The transition from the absolute security of power to the cold realization of betrayal did not happen with a scream or a gunshot. For Antonio Rizzo, it began with a microscopic shift in the geometry of his world. In the high-stakes theater of the underworld, survival was predicated on the mastery of patterns, and Antonio was a man who lived and breathed the rhythm of his empire. He knew the exact timing of the gate rotations at his estate, the precise interval of his security team's radio checks, and the specific, heavy weight of the air when his men were focused and loyal. But on a Tuesday evening that seemed indistinguishable from 1,000 others, the air felt thin. It started with the security logs, a series of digital breadcrumbs that only a man obsessed with the quiet would ever think to follow. As he sat in his study, the amber glow of a single lamp casting long, skeletal shadows across the room, Antonio pulled the raw data from the perimeter servers. He wasn't looking for intruders. He was looking for a lack of perfection. What he found made the blood in his veins turn to slush. 3 seconds. Every night for the past week at exactly 2:14 a.m., there was a 3-second lag in the feed from camera 14, the lens that overlooked the private terrace outside Alina's bedroom. To a technician, it was a glitch, a momentary packet loss in the fiber optic line. To Antonio, it was a signature. Someone within his own tech detail was manually looping the feed to mask a specific movement. He felt a sharp, crystalline prickle at the base of his skull, the instinct of a predator realizing the tall grass was moving in a way the wind couldn't explain. He didn't call for his head of security. He didn't reach for the internal intercom. Instead, he leaned back into the leather of his chair, his fingers subconsciously twisting the gold wedding ring on his left hand. The silent leak had begun. It was the most dangerous kind of treason, the kind that grows in the shade of absolute trust. He realized then that the walls he had built to keep the world away from Alina were no longer under his control. The fortress had become a cage, and the keys were being duplicated by the very men he had fed for decades. He spent the next 4 hours in a state of hyper-focused observation, moving through his home not as a master, but as a ghost observing his own haunting. He watched Roman Volkov through the tinted glass of the upper hallway. Roman, his primary enforcer, a man who had been at Antonio's side since the early days of the Boston Turf Wars, was standing by the fountain in the courtyard. Roman wasn't checking the perimeter, he was checking his watch. It was a rhythmic, nervous tick that Antonio had never seen before. Roman's posture, usually that of a loyal hound, had shifted into something more predatory, a wolf waiting for the alpha to stumble. Antonio watched as Nico Calderon joined him, their conversation hushed and urgent, their eyes darting toward the second-story windows where Alina sat reading. The realization settled into Antonio's gut like a lead weight. They weren't just watching the house for threats. They were mapping the vulnerabilities of his heart. They had crossed the line that separated business from blood. In the unspoken code of the Rizzo organization, the family was sacred, but Roman and the inner circle had clearly decided that the code was an outdated relic of a man who had grown too soft for the modern world. The depth of the betrayal became clearer when Antonio checked the GPS logs of the armored SUVs. He found that 2 of the vehicles had been redirected to the estate on their off hours, loitering on the ridge overlooking the valley for hours at a time. They were timing the police response. They were measuring the distance between the front gate and the safe room. They were preparing for a hit that was meant to be surgical and final. Antonio felt a cold, simmering rage, not the hot, explosive anger of a younger man, but the calculated, lethal chill of the Black Quiet. He looked at the wedding ring on his finger, the gold reflecting the moonlight streaming through the window. For years, he had believed he could be both the boss and the husband, the monster and the man. He had thought he could protect Alina by simply keeping her separate from the blood, but by keeping her in the bubble, he had made her the perfect target. He had given his enemies a single point of failure. As the night deepened, Antonio stood by the window, watching the silhouettes of his men moving through the gardens. They looked like protectors to the untrained eye, but Antonio saw them for what they were, surveyors of a tomb. He realized that the silent leak wasn't just about information, it was a leak of authority. The moment they decided they could watch his wife with murderous intent was the moment he ceased to be their king. They were waiting for a signal, a moment of weakness, or perhaps just the right price from a rival faction. He knew he couldn't just kill them, not yet. To strike now would be to start a civil war in the middle of his own living room, putting Alina directly in the crossfire. He had to be smarter. He had to be quieter. He began to plan the purge, a systematic dismantling of everything he had built, starting with the very communication lines that were now being used against him. He thought back to his rise, to the bodies he had stepped over to ensure Alina would never have to see a drop of blood. He had built an empire on the promise of silence, and now that silence was being used to drown him. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had taught Roman everything, how to anticipate a move, how to find the weak spot in a rival's armor, how to wait for the perfect moment to strike. Now, his best student was using those lessons to measure the diameter of his mentor's neck. Antonio felt a strange sense of clarity amidst the betrayal. The silent leak had stripped away the illusions. He saw that he could no longer stay in the center of the web had become a noose. If he wanted Alina to live, the boss had to die. But he wouldn't die at their hands. He would die on his own terms, taking the entire underworld down with him. He watched as Alina walked past the study door, her silhouette graceful and oblivious. She paused, as if sensing his gaze, and for a moment, Antonio considered telling her everything. He wanted to tell her to pack a bag, to run, to leave him behind. But he knew that as long as he was the Black Quiet, she would never truly be safe. The only way to save her was to become a man who didn't exist, and to ensure that the men watching her from the shadows were erased from the earth. He turned back to the monitors, his face a mask of granite. He would let them watch. He would let them believe their leak was silent. He would lead them right to the edge of their ambition, and then he would let the ground vanish beneath their feet. The time for the boss was ending. The time for the consequence was about to begin. He reached for his phone, the one he would eventually lay on the table, and began to send the encrypted messages that would set his final play in motion. Each vibration of the device felt like a countdown. The inner circle thought they were the ones lurking in the dark, but they had forgotten that Antonio Rizzo was the one who had invented the darkness they were standing in. He watched Roman look up at the study window, their eyes almost meeting through the glass in the night. Roman offered a small, respectful nod, the ultimate lie. Antonio didn't move. He didn't blink. He simply recorded the moment of treason in the ledger of his mind. The silent leak was no longer a secret. It was a death warrant, and Antonio was the only one who knew how to sign it. He would wait for the final proof, for the witness to bring the contract, and then he would perform the ritual of the ring. Until then, he would play the part of the unsuspecting king, watching his wolves prepare for a feast they would never get to taste. The air in the house remained thin, but Antonio had learned a long time ago how to breathe when others would suffocate. The shadows inside the hollowed-out chapel of St. Jude felt more like physical weight than an absence of light. Antonio sat in the third pew, his hands resting on his knees, his wedding ring catching the faint, flickering glow of prayer candles that smelled of melting wax and ancient dust. He didn't look up when the heavy oak doors groaned open. He didn't need to. He recognized the uneven gait of Luca Ferraro, the click of a heel, the drag of a soul. Luca was a man who lived in the margins, a professional observer of the things people usually killed to keep hidden. He was the city's most dangerous librarian, and tonight he was carrying a volume Antonio wasn't sure he was ready to read. Luca slid into the pew behind him, his breath a wheeze of tobacco and old age. For a long minute, neither man spoke. The silence of the chapel was absolute, save for the distant hum of the city that Antonio had ruled for 20 years, a city that was currently plotting his execution. "I took a risk coming here, Antonio," Luca whispered, his voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "The wolves are no longer just circling the house. They've started marking the territory." Antonio didn't move. His gaze remained fixed on the altar, on the statue of the saint of lost causes. He felt the coldness of the chapel seep into his bones, a precursor to the silence he knew was coming. "Show me," Antonio commanded. His voice was the black quiet at its most lethal, low, steady, and devoid of the vibration of fear. He heard the rustle of a manila envelope. Luca slid it over the back of the pew. It landed with a soft thud against Antonio's coat. Antonio didn't open it immediately. He knew that the moment his eyes touched the contents, the world he had built for Elena would officially begin to burn. He felt the gold band on his finger, a symbol of a life that was about to be amputated. When he finally pulled the documents from the envelope, the first thing he saw wasn't a contract but a photograph. It was a high-resolution shot of Elena taken through the glass of their sunroom. She was laughing, holding a cup of tea, a lock of hair falling over her eyes. But superimposed over her heart was a red digital crosshair. It wasn't a threat, it was a calibration. Antonio felt a surge of ice water in his veins, a physiological shutdown that replaced his humanity with the cold clockwork of a killer. Beneath the photo was the warning, the physical evidence of the treason. It was a wire transfer receipt from a Cayman account linked to Roman Volkov, paid out to a crew of freelancers from the coast known for clean jobs. The memo line was empty, but the amount was the exact price of a queen's life in the underworld. "The hit is signed, Antonio," Luca murmured, leaning closer. "Roman didn't just leak the security gaps, he sold the window. They aren't going to take you out first. They think if they take her, you'll crumble. They think the black quiet will become the black noise, screaming for revenge and making mistakes. They want you to lead them to the vaults in a fit of grief." Antonio stared at the crosshair on his wife's chest. The logic was sound, clinical, and utterly ruthless. It was exactly what he would have done 20 years ago to a rival who had grown soft with love. The irony was a bitter pill that tasted like copper. He had spent a lifetime making sure no one knew her face, and now his own hand-picked enforcer had turned her image into a target. "Who else knows?" Antonio asked. Luca sighed, a sound of profound exhaustion. "Nico is in for 30%. Thomas is handling the perimeter blackout. They've already told the families that you're stepping down voluntarily or otherwise. The contract says she goes Friday. That gives you 3 days, Antonio. 3 days before the bubble pops." Antonio finally turned his head, his eyes meeting Luca's. For a second, the librarian of the Underworld recoiled. He had seen Antonio angry, and he had seen him cold, but he had never seen the look that was currently occupying the boss's face. It was the look of a man who had already died and was simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. "Thank you, Luca," Antonio said, his voice terrifyingly gentle. He reached into his pocket and produced a thick stack of currency, sliding it back without looking. Luca took it, but he didn't leave. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "Are you going to call the men, start a purge?" Antonio stood up, the gold ring on his finger feeling like a lead weight. He looked at the statue of St. Jude one last time. "No," he replied. "The men I thought I had are already gone. If I start a war now, she dies in the crossfire. No, Luca, I'm not going to start a purge. I'm going to disappear. But before I go, I'm going to make sure that the throne they want so badly is sitting in a room filled with gasoline." He walked out of the chapel and into the night, the weight of the witnesses' warning heavy in his chest. Every shadow on the street now looked like an assassin. Every passing car felt like a scout. He realized that his power was an illusion, a ghost ship being steered by mutineers. He drove home in total silence, the engines hum the only thing keeping him anchored to reality. He knew what had to happen next. He had to face Alina. He had to look into those eyes, the eyes that had been his only sanctuary, and realize that he was seeing them for the last time as her husband. The last waltz was no longer a metaphor. It was a countdown. He would give her one final night of peace, one final night of the bubble, before he performed the ritual that would turn him into the very thing the underworld feared most, a man with nothing left to protect. When he pulled into the driveway, he saw Roman standing near the gate, the loyal enforcer offering a respectful nod. Antonio nodded back, his face a perfect mask of granite. Inside, his mind was already dismantling Roman's life, piece by treacherous piece. He went to his study and locked the door, laying the photograph of Alina on the desk. He traced the lines of the crosshair with his thumb. The leak was no longer silent. It was a roar in his ears. The warning had been delivered and the witness had been paid. Now the only thing left was the sacrifice. He reached for the gold band on his finger, twisting it slowly. It was still there, for now. But as the clock on the wall ticked toward midnight, Antonio Rizzo began the transition. The boss was preparing the room. The ghost was preparing the fire. And the man who loved Alina was preparing to say a goodbye she would never hear. The drive back from the chapel was the longest of Antonio's life. The city lights of Boston blurred into long, jagged streaks of neon, looking less like a home and more like a circuit board he was about to short-circuit. He parked the car and sat in the darkness of the garage for a full minute, his hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles were white. He was a man who had ordered executions with the casual tone one uses to order coffee, but the thought of walking through the front door to face Alina made his chest feel like it was being crushed by a hydraulic press. This was the last waltz, the final hours of a 20-year masquerade. When he entered the house, the air felt different. It was no longer the scent of expensive floor wax and home, it was the scent of a museum. Everything was static, preserved, and doomed. He found Alina in the living room, the soft glow of the fireplace dancing in her dark hair. She was mending a small tear in a silk scarf, her movements fluid and peaceful. To anyone else, she was a woman of leisure. To Antonio, she was a miracle he had stolen from a better world. "You're late, Antonio," she said, not looking up, but her voice carried a playful warmth that cut through him like a blade. "I kept the pasta warm, but the wine has been breathing so long it might actually start talking back." "I had a meeting with the port authorities," he lied. The words tasted like ash. He moved toward her, his shadow stretching long across the Persian rug, and placed a hand on her shoulder. He felt the delicate warmth of her skin through her sweater. This was the woman Roman had put in a crosshair. This was the woman Nico had sold for 30 pieces of silver. "Is everything okay?" she asked, finally looking up. Her eyes, usually so sharp and full of life, clouded with a sudden, intuitive concern. She had lived with the black quiet long enough to read the silence between his breaths. "You look different tonight." "Just tired, Alina," he whispered. He sat beside her, closer than usual, as if trying to merge his shadow with hers. Let's not eat yet. Just stay here with me for a moment." They sat in the quiet of the estate, a silence that Antonio had spent millions to maintain. For 2 decades he had kept the bubble intact, ensuring that no whisper of his true nature ever stained the walls of their sanctuary. But tonight, the bubble felt paper-thin. He could almost hear the footsteps of the men outside, the men who were currently timing the gap in the security cameras. He looked at the gold band on his finger. It felt like it was burning his skin. This ring was his promise to be her protector, but he realized now that the only way to protect her was to stop being the man who wore it. "Antonio," she said softly, laying her hand over his. "Whatever it is, we've handled it before. The strikes, the investigations. We always come out the other side." Not this time, he thought, but he didn't say it. Instead, he stood up and offered his hand. "Dance with me." There was no music, only the crackle of the hearth and the distant, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock that sounded like a countdown. She laughed, a sound of pure, unsuspecting joy that broke his heart into 1,000 jagged pieces. They moved slowly across the floor, a ghost and a woman, dancing on the edge of a precipice. He held her tight, his chin resting on the top of her head, memorizing the way she leaned into his chest. He was memorizing the weight of her, the rhythm of her heart, and the way she sighed when she felt safe. As they swayed, Antonio's mind was 1,000 miles away, calculating the logistics of the coming storm. He thought about the offshore accounts he had activated, the new identities he had forged for her, and the faceless men who would soon take her to a place where the name Rizzo meant nothing. He was mourning a life that hadn't ended yet. To save her, he had to become a monster she would never recognize. He had to walk into that warehouse tomorrow and lay down his ring, and in doing so, he would become a stranger to the only person who truly knew him. "You're squeezing me, Antonio," she teased gently. He loosened his grip but didn't let go. "I just don't want to forget this moment." "How could you forget?" she smiled, pulling back to look at him. "We have a lifetime of moments left." He forced a smile, a grimace of a mask that felt heavy on his face. "Of course," he lied again, "a lifetime." He stayed awake long after she fell asleep. He stood on the balcony, watching the orange embers of his cigar glow in the dark. Below, in the shadows of the cypress trees, he saw the faint glint of moonlight on a rifle barrel. Roman's men. They were out there, waiting for the clock to run out. Antonio looked down at his phone, lying on the nightstand. It was silent now, but tomorrow it would be the catalyst for a massacre. He went back inside and looked at Alina one last time as she slept, her face serene and untouched by the horror he was about to unleash. He didn't kiss her. He didn't want to wake her and see the love in her eyes, not when he knew that by this time tomorrow he would be the man who abandoned her. He walked to his study, the last waltz officially over, and began to prep the invitation for the 4 wolves. The music had stopped. The house was cold. The black quiet was ready to scream. The transition from the last waltz to the invitation was marked by a sudden, jarring shift in Antonio's internal temperature. The warmth of the fireplace and the softness of Alina's skin were replaced by the cold, metallic reality of his office. He sat behind the heavy oak desk, the warning photo of Alina still lying face down in the top drawer. It was 3:00 a.m. The house was silent, but the air was screaming. Antonio picked up the old-style phone, the one that had coordinated the rise of an empire. His movements were slow, almost ritualistic. He wasn't just sending a message. He was sending a summons to a funeral, though the men receiving it still believed they were the ones holding the shovel. He opened the encrypted channel used only for the highest level of quiet operations. His fingers didn't tremble as he typed the 4 words that would change the trajectory of the city. Warehouse 7, 900, finality. He hit send. One by one, the delivery receipts flickered back. Roman Volkov, Nico Calderon, Thomas Kovach, and Luca Ferraro. There was no hesitation in their replies. They were hungry. To them, finality meant the boss was surrendering the keys. They thought they were coming to collect a crown. They didn't realize they were coming to witness an execution of the status quo. Antonio spent the remaining hours of the night in a state of clinical preparation. He didn't pack a bag. He didn't take jewelry or cash. A man who is about to become a ghost has no use for physical weight. He focused entirely on the digital and tactical infrastructure. He accessed the server nodes he had hidden throughout the city, insurance policies he had built over 20 years for a day he hoped would never come. He verified the offshore accounts he had set up for Alina's new life, ensuring the paths were scrubbed and the handlers were paid through dead man switches. At 8:00 a.m., he walked out of the estate without looking back. He didn't say goodbye to Alina. To see her face one more time would be to invite a doubt he couldn't afford. He climbed into the matte black sedan, and as he drove down the winding driveway, he watched Roman Volkov pull in behind him in a secondary vehicle. In the rearview mirror, Roman's face was a mask of professional loyalty, but Antonio saw the way the younger man gripped the steering wheel. Roman was already driving like a king. The drive to the industrial district was a procession through a kingdom that was already being dismantled. Warehouse 7 sat at the edge of the docks, a rusted, hulking shell that smelled of salt, oil, and old secrets. It was a place where quiet business was handled, where people went to disappear or to be born again. As Antonio pulled into the gravel lot, he saw the other cars already parked. Nico and Thomas were standing by the loading dock, their dark suits stark against the gray, overcast sky. They were armed, their stances wide, their eyes tracking Antonio's car with a new, disrespectful intensity. They didn't bow their heads as he approached. The invitation had been accepted, and the power dynamic had already begun to rot. Inside the warehouse, the air was frigid. A single industrial light hung over a small wooden table in the center of the vast, echoing space. Antonio walked to the table and sat down. He didn't invite them to sit. He waited as the 4 men gathered behind him, the sound of their leather shoes on the concrete sounding like the ticking of a clock. He felt the heat of their presence, the tension of 4 loaded weapons hidden beneath 4 dark jackets. "You called us, boss," Roman said. His voice was steady, but there was an edge of triumph he couldn't quite hide. "The word is finality. We're here for the transition." Antonio didn't turn around. He stared into the darkness beyond the light. He could feel the gold ring on his finger, the last piece of the man he used to be. The invitation was complete. The wolves were in the room. Now it was time for the ritual. "The transition has already begun, Roman," Antonio said, his voice a low, terrifying hum. "But you've misunderstood the terms. You think you're here to take over. I'm here to make sure there's nothing left to take." He reached for his left hand. The room went deathly silent. Every man in the warehouse held their breath, their fingers twitching toward their holsters. They expected a gun. They expected a fight. What they got was something much more final. The warehouse felt like a pressure cooker on the verge of structural failure. The overhead light hummed with a low, electric buzz, casting sharp, jagged shadows across the concrete floor. Antonio sat perfectly still, the back of his neck feeling the heat of 4 loaded barrels aimed at his skull. Behind him, Roman Volkov, Nico Calderon, Thomas Kovac, and Luca Ferraro stood like statues of treason. They were waiting for the black quiet to break, to plead, or to pull a weapon in a futile final stand. Instead, Antonio reached for his left hand. The movement was slow, agonizingly deliberate. Roman's finger tightened on the trigger of his Glock, the click of the safety being disengaged echoing through the cavernous space. But Antonio didn't reach for a holster. His hand moved to the gold band on his ring finger, the anchor of his soul, the symbol of the man who loved Alina. With a gentle, twisting motion, he slid the ring off. The gold caught the harsh industrial light for a split second before Antonio placed it on the scarred wooden table. It didn't clatter. It sat down with a soft, heavy thud that sounded, to the men behind him, like the closing of a tomb. Next, he reached into his inner pocket and pulled out the old-style phone. This device had been the heart of the city's nervous system, a conduit for billions of dollars and thousands of lives. He laid it face up next to the ring. "The boss is dead," Antonio said. His voice was devoid of emotion, a flat, terrifying monotone that chilled the room more than the winter air coming off the docks. He finally turned his chair around, his eyes closed. He didn't want to look at them, not because he was afraid, but because they were already ghosts in his mind. By removing the ring, he had severed his connection to Alina's world. By putting down the phone, he had cut the lines of his own authority. "You wanted the throne, Roman," Antonio whispered, his eyes still shut. "You sold my wife's life for a chair made of blood. You think that by holding those guns, you are in control, but you've forgotten the most basic rule of the quiet." He opened his eyes then, and for the first time in 20 years, the men saw the monster without the mask. There was no mercy left in the man sitting before them. "The phone didn't just give orders," Antonio continued. "It held the safety on the city. It kept the feds at bay, the rivals in their holes, and the street bosses in line. That phone was the only thing standing between you and the void." He stood up slowly, his hands empty and open at his sides. He walked past the guns, his shoulder brushing against Roman's chest. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The abdication was complete. He had stripped himself of his name, his rank, and his humanity. "As of this moment," Antonio said, his voice receding into the darkness of the warehouse, "there are no more rules. There is no more protection. You aren't taking over an empire. You're standing in a graveyard and the gates just locked behind you." The gunmen stood frozen, the weapons in their hands suddenly feeling like toys. They looked at the ring and the phone on the table, two small objects that held the weight of a world that was already beginning to collapse. The abdication was not a surrender, it was a release. Antonio Rizzo was gone. Only the consequence remained. The atmosphere in the warehouse shifted from a standoff to a vacuum. By placing the ring and the phone on the table, Antonio hadn't just surrendered his rank. He had removed the gravity that kept their world from spinning into the sun. Roman, Nico, and Thomas stood with their weapons leveled, but their faces betrayed a sudden, gnawing vacuum of confidence. They were holding the guns, but Antonio was the only one who looked powerful. "You don't understand the math of this life, Roman," Antonio said, his voice echoing off the corrugated steel walls like a funeral bell. "You think power is a sum of how many men you have behind you. You think it's an addition of territory and tribute. You're wrong. True power is subtraction. It's what's left when you take away everything a man has to lose." He stepped closer to Roman, the barrel of the Glock inches from his sternum. Antonio didn't flinch. He looked at his former protege with a pity that was more insulting than a slap. "That phone on the table, it's currently transmitting a dead man's signal," Antonio explained, his tone conversational, almost academic. "For 20 years I've paid the city's silence. I've balanced the books between the Irish, the cartels, and the feds. I was the bridge. By putting that phone down, I didn't give you the bridge, I blew it up." The weight of the power of zero began to sink in. In the underworld, a boss is a shield as much as a leader. He is the one who negotiates the peace and absorbs the heat. Without Antonio's quiet, the city was about to become a free-for-all. Every rival gang that had stayed in the shadows out of respect or fear was currently receiving a notification that the peace treaty was void. Every federal agent on the Rizzo payroll was watching their encrypted accounts vanish. "You wanted to be the boss, Roman? Fine. Start by explaining to the Irish why their shipments aren't protected anymore. Explain to the feds why the monthly tribute just stopped. You have the throne, but I've drained the ocean around the castle. You aren't kings. You're just targets in expensive suits." Antonio turned his back on them, walking toward the heavy sliding door of the warehouse. It was the ultimate display of zero. He no longer cared if they pulled the trigger. To him, they were already irrelevant. He had stripped away his identity, his marriage, and his future. He was a man with a zero-sum soul, and that made him the most dangerous predator they had ever encountered. "The rules are gone," Antonio's voice drifted back from the darkness. "No more hierarchy, no more protocols, just the consequences. Sleep well, Roman. It's the last time you'll ever close your eyes and feel safe." As Antonio vanished into the gray morning mist, the gunmen remained in the light of the single bulb, staring at the gold ring and the black phone. They had won the war, but as the first sirens began to wail in the distance, far too many sirens for a routine patrol, they realized they had inherited a kingdom of ashes. The moment Antonio stepped out of the warehouse, he ceased to be a man and became a ghost in the machine. He had spent 20 years building the city's digital and physical architecture, and he knew every trapdoor, every blind spot, and every hidden kill switch. While Roman and his crew were inside staring at a silent phone, Antonio was already 3 moves ahead, navigating a world they didn't even know existed. He didn't head for a getaway car. He headed for a nondescript service tunnel beneath the docks, a passage he had reinforced years ago for a day just like this. He moved with a predatory grace that defied his age. In the damp, echoing darkness of the tunnel, he reached into a hidden alcove and pulled out a ruggedized laptop, the black box of his empire. For the next hour, he was a wraith behind a screen. He wasn't just hiding, he was systematic. He began the Ghost Protocol, a sequence of digital strikes designed to erase the traitors from the very world they sought to rule. He didn't need to fire a single bullet yet. He let the systems do the work. First, he targeted their finances. With a few keystrokes, the offshore accounts Roman and Nico relied on were not just frozen. They were liquidated and scattered across 10,000 anonymous charity wallets. Next, he went for their communications. He didn't just cut their phones. He rerouted their private messages to the very rivals they had betrayed. He made sure the Irish knew exactly who had sold them out, and he ensured the cartels received the GPS coordinates of Nico's private stash houses. He was turning the city into a heat-seeking missile, and he had painted the traitors' foreheads with the laser. By the time the sun fully crested over the Atlantic, Antonio was no longer in the tunnels. He was perched in a high-rise observation deck, watching the city through a pair of high-powered binoculars. He saw the first ripples of the Ghost War. Black SUVs, Roman's men, were being intercepted by unmarked tactical teams. Fires were breaking out at the docks where Thomas's crews operated. The infrastructure of the Rizzo Empire was collapsing, not from an outside invasion, but because the architect had decided to pull the foundation. He felt no remorse. Every explosion in the distance, every siren that wailed through the morning air, was a layer of protection for Alina. He was the ghost haunting his own halls, an invisible force that was dismantling 20 years of history in 20 minutes. He looked down at his bare ring finger. The skin pale where the gold had once been. He was a man with no bank account, no home, and no name. He was the ultimate weapon, a man who could see everything and be seen by no one. As he watched his former headquarters go dark, he knew the Judas Fall was entering its final phase. Roman and the others were now trapped in a world where their money was gone, their allies were their executioners, and their boss was a phantom they couldn't find. Antonio closed the laptop and stood up. The digital war was won. Now it was time for the physical one. He had a list of names, and he didn't need a phone to find them. Inside Warehouse 7, the silence was finally broken by the sound of Roman Volkov laughing, a brittle, hollow sound that died the moment he reached for the phone Antonio had left behind. He picked it up with a proprietary smirk, expecting to find the keys to the city. But as the screen flickered to life, the smirk vanished. The display didn't show a contact list or a bank balance. It showed a countdown timer, glowing a malevolent red with only 4 seconds remaining. Underneath the numbers, a single line of text pulsed. "The debt is called in." The Judas Fall began with a simultaneous vibration in the pockets of every man in the room. As Roman dropped Antonio's phone in a panic, Nico and Thomas pulled out their own devices. They weren't receiving messages. They were receiving notifications of their own erasure. In a flash of digital lightning, their encrypted accounts, the millions they had bled the city for, hit zero. The screens then began to scroll through their most private betrayals. Every secret deal Roman had made with the feds, every cent Nico had stolen from the Irish, and every location of Thomas's hidden families. "He didn't just quit," Nico whispered, his voice trembling as he watched his entire life's work being broadcast to every rival gang in the state. He broadcast the ledger. The realization hit them like a physical blow. The phone Antonio had left on the table wasn't a gift, it was a beacon. It had already finished uploading the Judas files to the very people they feared most. Outside, the screech of tires echoed through the industrial park. These weren't the police. These were the rivals, the Irish, the Russians, and the street bosses, who had just learned that the men who sold out Antonio Rizzo were now unprotected and holding all the blame for the city's collapse. Roman looked at the gold ring still sitting on the table. He reached for it, a desperate grab for some symbol of the power he thought he'd won, but his hand stopped midair. The ring, like the phone, was a curse. To where it was to inherit the target Antonio had spent 20 years dodging. Suddenly, the warehouse lights cut out, plunged into a darkness so absolute it felt like being buried alive. The only light remaining was the red glow of the countdown hitting 0. A single, muffled thud echoed from the loading dock, followed by the terrifyingly calm sound of a door being locked from the outside. Antonio hadn't just left them, he had discarded them in a cage of their own making. Roman, the man who wanted to be king, realized in the dark that he was nothing more than a sacrificial lamb. Antonio had used their own greed to tether them to a sinking ship. The Judas fall was complete. The traitors were trapped in a tomb of their own ambitions, waiting for the monsters they had unleashed to come through the door. The rain began to fall in heavy, rhythmic sheets, washing the grime of the city into the gutters as Antonio stood in the deep shadows of an alleyway across from the coastal safe house. This was the ultimate sacrifice. He was less than 50 yards away from Alina, yet the distance felt like a vast, unbridgeable canyon. He stood perfectly still, his dark coat soaked through, his eyes fixed on the warm, amber light of the window. He was a man who had commanded armies, yet he was now reduced to a silent observer of the life he was about to lose forever. 2 black sedans, unmarked and unassuming, pulled into the driveway with professional precision. These were not his men, they were the Erasers, a specialized extraction team he had paid a king's ransom to ensure they operated with 0 paper trail and absolute loyalty to the contract, not the man. He watched as the front door opened. Alina stepped out, flanked by 2 guards. She looked confused, her head darting back toward the house as if expecting Antonio to step out from the foyer and tell her it was all a mistake. Antonio clutched the brickwork of the alley so hard his fingers bled. He wanted to scream her name. He wanted to run across the wet pavement, pull her into his arms, and tell her that the black quiet was gone, that they could just be Antonio and Alina again. But he knew that if he did, the target on his back would instantly transfer to hers. To love her was to stay dead. He watched as she was ushered into the back of the lead car. For a split second, she paused, her eyes scanning the dark alleyways and the rain-slicked streets, as if sensing the ghost of the man who had promised to protect her. She didn't see him, he wouldn't allow it. The car doors closed with a finality that echoed louder than a gunshot. As the taillights faded into the gray mist of the morning, Antonio felt the last of his heart go cold. He had ensured she was safe, wealthy, and free from the rot of his world. But the price was total. She would live the rest of her life believing he was just another statistic of the underworld, a man who chose power over her. He had saved her life by destroying her heart, and he had saved his soul by becoming a phantom. He stood in the rain until the sound of the engines had long since vanished, replaced by the hollow whistle of the wind coming off the harbor. He was a man with no ring, no phone, and no home. He had fulfilled his last promise, and in doing so, he had achieved the ultimate quiet. He turned away from the house, walking in the opposite direction of the cars, disappearing into the fog like a memory that was already starting to fade. 6 months had passed, But the name Antonio Rizzo was no longer spoken in the boardrooms or the back alleys of Boston. It was whispered, a cautionary tale used to chill the blood of those who thought they were untouchable. This was the era of beyond the grave. The city's underworld had been reshaped by the vacuum he left behind, a chaotic, fractured landscape where the four wolves were nothing more than a memory of a single, violent night. No one knew for sure what happened in Warehouse 7, but the story said that when the police finally broke the locks, they found no bodies, only a gold ring and a dead phone sitting on a table, and a room that smelled of ozone and absolute surrender. The legend of the Black Quiet had transcended the man. To the new generation of soldiers, he was the ghost who saw everything and said nothing. They said that if you betrayed your family, if you looked at the boss's wife with greed in your heart, the ring would appear on your desk as a silent death warrant. He had become a mythological figure, a specter of consequence that kept a fragile, terrified peace across the territories. Antonio had achieved in death what he could never quite master in life, a city that was finally perfectly quiet. In a small, sun-drenched coastal town thousands of miles away, a woman known only as Maria lived a life of quiet luxury. She spent her mornings tending to a garden that overlooked the Mediterranean, her face serene, though her eyes often drifted toward the horizon with a melancholic longing. She was safe, she was wealthy, and she was entirely alone. Every month a bouquet of white lilies would appear on her doorstep with no card, no name, and no explanation. She never asked where they came from. In her heart, she knew the flowers were a message from a ghost, a reminder that even from beyond the grave, someone was still watching over her. Antonio Rizzo, or the man who used to be him, sat in a dim cafe in a city where no one knew his face. He wore a simple linen shirt and no jewelry. He didn't carry a phone. He watched the world go by with the detached gaze of a man who had already finished his story. He had no empire, no soldiers, and no crown. But as he looked at his bare hand, he felt a lightness he hadn't known in 40 years. He had burned his world to ash to save a single flame, and as the sun set over the distant water, he knew the sacrifice was worth it. The underworld was over, the legend was born, and for the first time in his life, the Black Quiet finally knew peace.